Hi, and welcome to the Dr. Z and J.W podcast. I'm J.W. Stewart, a veteran broadcaster and journalist with nearly 30 years' experience. I've worked at ESPN and NBC, and now I teach at the University of New Haven.
And I'm Sheahon Zenger. I started my career as a football coach at Drake, Kansas State, South Florida, and Wyoming, before becoming the director of athletics at Illinois State University, the University of Kansas, and now the University of New Haven. And this is the Dr. Z and J.W podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Dr. Z and J.W podcast, brought to you by our presenting sponsor, the Pink Clover Foundation. Thank you for joining us across all of our social media platforms. And as always, our podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. I'm J.W. Stewart, joined by our athletic director, Sheahon Zenger, and our special guest today is Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, the assistant provost for diversity and inclusion at the University of New Haven. He's also the director of the Center for Advanced Policing. Dr. Boyd or Lorenzo, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know Dr. Z and you know each other a little bit. Dr. Z, how have you gotten to know Lorenzo?
Well, Lorenzo was in one of my first weeks here. The provost's office did a presentation to the cabinet. And, you know, Lorenzo's one of those guys who just kind of larger than life and jumps out. And I'm like, I got to get to know this guy. He seems really fun. And he is. Unfortunately, because of COVID, you know, he and I have been trying to get together for a long time, and we tried to crash the backyard of a colleague of ours, and I think we got uninvited because they're more careful. You know, they were being careful. We're teasing, but just, you know, Lorenzo's one of those individuals that just kind of lights up the room, and we have a lot of shared interests and commonalities, and you know, it's exciting. We've had a lot of really good guests in our young podcast, but none more important than whom Lorenzo is and the message he has for us today.
I would agree with you 100%. This is no question the most timely and topical podcast that we've done based on what's going on in our country. And just a brief recap, on May 25th, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who was white, held his knee on the neck of George Floyd, who was black, for 8 minutes, which resulted in the death of Mr. Floyd at the age of 46. Chauvin and 3 other officers have all been charged in Floyd's death. All 4 officers were fired on May 26th. And since then, there have been protests and riots all over the United States and peaceful protests all over the world, as our country still struggles with systemic racism and police brutality. And Lorenzo, you are an expert in this field. You were a police officer at one point early on in your career before switching over to academia and your background in sociology. And we'll get to that in a minute. But since May 25th, May 26th, the last week and a half, what has that been like for you?
Well, it's been surreal, to say the least, and the amount of people that have been reaching out has been almost overwhelming. And, you know, it runs the Marriott. A lot of people are angry, some people are hurt, some people don't know. And a lot of people have reached out to me privately and said, I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. And, you know, and that's okay too. It's okay not to be able to process this. And a lot of times we spend time with people trying to make sense of what's actually going on. We try to make sense of a senseless incident.
And how do we do that? How do you make sense of something like this? And unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. You know, it's every couple of years something like this keeps happening. And we still have trouble processing it. How do we get to that point? And I know you can't do it with the snap of your fingers, but what's some of the advice that you give people in terms of processing?
Well, let's take a step back and unpack what's going on, because this isn't just George Floyd, or it isn't just Breonna Taylor, or it isn't just Ahmaud Arbery. Those are the 3 that just came in rapid succession over the last couple of weeks. But we can go back to Trayvon Martin, or Michael Brown, or Eric Garner, or Sandra Bland. The list goes on and on and on. And there has been a negative relationship between the police and communities of color since we had a country. And the foundation of policing in this country actually started with slave patrols. So even back then, from the very beginning, there's been this negative relationship. So then to say in 2020 that we have a real problem, It just says that for multiple generations, for a few centuries, we just never really delved into it and dealt with the problem. So the question now is, now that we're here, we're at this snapshot in history, what do we do now to move forward? And that's kind of the question that I ask people. That's a lot of the conversation that I try to lead. And we can't ignore what happens. And a lot of people say, I get the history, let's forget about the history. We can't forget about the history because the history frames what we do moving forward. And then to say that it's a racial issue alone, I think diminishes the problem. It's a systemic failure in the criminal justice system. So all aspects of the criminal justice system needs to be changed. We need wide sweeping policy changes. But again, that's not to say that all people in the system are bad or malicious, because I definitely don't believe that's the case at all. It's just people are working in a flawed system, and you then get flawed results. You know, remember from your intro computer class, garbage in, garbage out? That's kind of how we deal with the criminal justice system now.
Lorenzo, as you say that, I'm thinking of our audience that we often have watching this podcast, and the numbers fluctuate depending on our topic and guest, and I'm anticipating large numbers with you as our guest. We also try to go inside, outside UNH, meaning someone from campus and then someone from outside of campus, and you kind of cover both areas because of your national reputation, and you shared with me and some of the others offline how many podcasts you've done recently. So in light of that, knowing we're going to have a number of students watching this today, could you share with us your path through from maybe college to policing to academia to UNH to the very point where you are right now, as you're able to give us all this information that so few of us would have without your insight?
I started my career at UMass in the early 80s, and whenever I say that, it just makes me feel like I'm a really old dude. But I started off as an engineering major. And as many student athletes realize, you're a student athlete. And engineering and NCAA football, for the best people, don't really mix. So, you know, when you have to make a choice between academics and athletics, well, for me, you know, a knee injury made the decision for me. But going through engineering, I had these burning questions that I couldn't understand. And the classes that were more fulfilling to me were my sociology classes, because I was watching what was going on around me. I grew up in Boston in the 70s through the tumultuous bus boycotts and, you know, the riots and stuff. And as a little kid, watching my older siblings go through the whole busing thing, trying to figure out what was going on. And I didn't have a real delineation of differences between Black people and white people. I just know that people told me that there were people who looked like this that I wasn't supposed to like. And I said, but he's my friend. I don't understand why I'm not supposed to like him. So I kind of carried that through. And going through my undergrad, I had tons and tons of questions. And my time at UMass did me well in answering some of the questions. But the older I got, the deeper the questions got. So I decided if I jumped into a master's degree program, I could answer some of these deeper questions. So right after college, I jumped immediately into the sheriff's department, not because I thought I wanted to fight crime and save lives necessarily. One was I needed a job and didn't want to move back into my parents' house. So part of it was I figured I'd jump in with the sheriff's department, and I stayed for 6 months. And truth be told, there's a story that most people never heard. My best friend and I applied for a job as an air traffic controller. And we were going to move to Derry, New Hampshire, and go to school for air traffic control. But the sheriff's department came up first. I figured I'd do this for a little while and then get out. And then, you know, just under 15 years later, I stayed in. But I did my whole master's degree and did my PhD all while being a sheriff's deputy. And it allowed me to ask myself some questions. And, you know, when you're first pinned and you're first badged, you hear the obligatory speech. No one is Black or white or male or female. Once you pin on this badge, we're all blue. But I started to see differences. And I started to see who got days off during the week and who got days off on the weekend. I noticed who tended to get summer vacations and who got vacations in April. And I noticed who got promoted and who didn't. And I noticed who got special assignments and who didn't. And I was trying to make sense of what's going on as a new person. And then I realized that we're all blue, but some of us are light blue and others of us are dark blue. And the rules of engagement are very different. So I took that through my PhD, fast forwarding to Northeastern University, and they were amazing in helping me work through this. And for part of my dissertation, I studied policing in Indianapolis and St. Petersburg in the 90s when they were both doing community policing. And I looked at attitude differences between black and white officers with quality of life policing, and published a piece called Light Blue versus Dark Blue. So throughout my whole career, trying to understand race relations is kind of what I've been doing. Because for me, there's nothing specific to this color of your skin or the pigment. The DNA doesn't really change. So I spend my whole career trying to figure out what these problems are and how can we bridge these gaps. So that's a longer answer to a shorter question.
You know, J.W. probably asked the more insightful questions. He's the he's the real professional here. But you answered the question that I thought I'd be the only one to ask. My academic nerd side was going to come out. I was going to ask, what was your dissertation on, and is it pertinent to what's going on today? And wow, it couldn't be more pertinent to what's going on today. So thank you I think that was really important for our students who are watching in particular, but everyone else to know that that is your specific academic background.
Lorenzo, as a police officer in Boston, did you notice police brutality?
You know, I remember when the Rodney King situation happened and the beating happened, working for the sheriff's department. This particular day, I was running an inmate housing unit in the county jail on this particular day. And when I saw what had happened, and I had previously in my past lived in LA for a short period of time, so I knew what Angelenos were going through, and I knew a lot of the stuff that was happening. And I remember thinking the same thing that people said later. Finally, we've got on video what people have been complaining about for years. And clearly, the justice system is going to do the right thing because we've got it on video. And then you can imagine, like everyone else in the country, how their hearts dropped when the officers were found not guilty in criminal court. So watching that happen and watching the stuff that happens, I also remember when the OJ trial happened, when all this happens in California, 3,000 miles away, there was a lot of times where I wouldn't wear my uniform, get dressed at home and then drive into work. I would go into work in my civvies and change there, because a lot of times I didn't want people to know what I did for work just because of the issues that were happening. And there's a term called double marginality that I learned firsthand, but it wasn't until way later in grad school where I understood what the concept was individually. It's people of color have been complaining about policing for generations. So a black person going into uniform, whether you're working for the sheriff's department or working for the courts or working for municipal police or working for the highway patrol, it doesn't matter. The uniform and the badge represents the same thing. So a lot of people in the black community feel you're selling us out because we see what the with uniformed officers are doing in our community, how they're wreaking havoc in our community. And many of the people that I saw in custody were people from my community, some from my neighborhood. Many of them, I knew who their families were, and they look at me with a level of disdain. And I'm thinking, you're the one arrested for committing a crime. Why are you looking at me with disdain? So then I started to understand that. But the flip side is, there's a lot of inherent racism in policing. Not all cops are racist. Don't ever think that that's what I'm saying. But if you look at policing in America, over 70% of police officers are white and over 80% are male. So the lens for policing in America is a white male dominated occupation. So that's the standard in policing. So there's a lot of folks in policing that when officers of color get hired, at least in the 80s and the 90s, everybody would throw the tokenism thing, or you just got hired because, we just had to increase our numbers. So there was never the, I deserved this job or I was worthy of this job to some of my colleagues. And a lot of the racism that happened in the community also happens within the ranks of policing. And I recently saw an interview. The former commissioner of Chicago, Gary McCarthy, did an interview with the rapper / entertainer Common. And Commissioner McCarthy said, policing itself doesn't have a race problem. America has a race problem, and we get police from the American populace. So the police are just representing what's going on in America. And that's one of the things that I've been studying policing and training police for 20 years. And for 15 years before that, I was in uniform. So 35 years of my life, I've been doing that. And then that's like a mind-blowing moment, how he framed that. So that's the lens that I tend to look, and that's the line that I tend to walk every day when I'm dealing with community members and dealing with police.
How are you trained, Lorenzo? Before we talk about how you train other people, both our students and police officers across the country, how are you trained as a police officer, specifically with regard to, how do you deal with community relations and de-escalating violence?
Well, going through the Sheriff's Department training, a lot of what you get is the same type of generic training. This is how you do law enforcement. This is how you enforce laws. This is how you arrest people. This is how you transport people. This is how you fire a weapon. There's not a whole lot of problem solving. And that's an intellectual trait that's developed. It's not something taught in the academy. Because the problem is a lot of academies, and I've taught in, I think, 30 different police academies across the country. The problem is you get the same story, that every call could be your last call and every violent encounter could end for you. Well, that's technically true. Technically, this could be my last podcast, technically. So, every meal could be your last meal. But statistically, the whole scenario that police officers are trained, the adage that there's a war on cops, is actually a false narrative, because statistically, that's not true. If you look at the history of policing over the last generation, right now is the safest to be a police officer since before the Nixon administration. So fewer police officers are killed feloniously now than since the 70s. So it's safe being police. But here's the other thing. The thing that we don't talk about, gentlemen, more police officers die at their own hand than by felonious assault. So the suicide rate is really, really high in policing, but that's a taboo that we can't talk about. And if you notice, New York PD, they average 1 suicide per month of police officers. They absolutely don't average 1 police officer getting killed per month. Absolutely not. So you're more likely to die at your own hand than to die from the bad guy trying to get you. So the narrative, us against them, war on cops, is a false narrative. And I think that anyone who spreads that type of rhetoric is being disingenuous and hurting relationships with the community that the police are sworn to serve and protect.
Lorenzo, if we're not criminal justice majors and we don't get to take a class with you, how does someone ever learn this information? I mean, all of this is, I'm sure, brand new for J.W. as it is for me with regard to policing and the history and where we are. How do we get this information out? And then secondly, where do you see the future of policing? And it sounded like when you gave the numbers that we were making some headway with regard to young men and women of diverse backgrounds entering the field. Do you see that continuing, or will the current situation impede that?
Well, that's a series of good questions, Doc. And let's unpack that a little bit. Let me answer a question that has not yet been asked so I can frame this story. So I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Policing. I'm not the director of the Center for Traditional Policing. So the premise of advanced policing is we have a lot of information. we've got decades of research that tells us what works and what doesn't work. The problem is with policing as an institution, and again, I'm not talking any one officer, but policing as an institution, police don't like two things. One, they don't like change, but also they don't like the way things are. So when we go in and work with the police, it's different because you have to start from a different place. So to go in to say, you know, I'm a PhD, I'm from the University of New Haven, it hits differently than when I say, I'm a former sheriff's deputy. I understand what it's like to be in uniform in a particular city. So, you know, that hits differently. But what we do in the Center for Advanced Policing, it's not just about building a better cop, because that was a lot of the rhetoric, you know, right around the 90s. You know, we're going to build a better cop as though we're doing the whole RoboCop thing. That's not at all what we're doing. Here, we try to spend time with high school students and college students, and we try to teach them empathy. We try to teach them compassion. We try to teach them lived experiences. So we're not trying to build a better cop. We're trying to develop a better person that then goes into policing. And the paradigm shift, I think, is really important, because if we can get people to understand what's going on, and as I said, I've been training police officers 20 years. Some years I do between 200 and 250 hours of training of police officers. And I trained the whole Yale University Police Department, 95 officers. Typically, when I train the police, I try to get community members in as well. And I want community members and police officers to hear the same story. I'm working on a grant now with the Tower Youth Justice Institute to train police officers in the Capital Region, General Hartford region, to train police officers how to more effectively deal with young people. And the tacit premise here, the underlying premise is that if we can get young people, sometimes that are justice involved, or community members, or communities of color in the same room with the police, we get to tear down barriers. And when I do the training, first names only. Nobody has a rank, nobody has a position. I want people to see each other as people. And when you come to the training, you can't come in uniform. You got to come in civilian clothes, because I want to break down barriers. And when we start talking, I tell stuff about myself, and as we go around the room, explain who you are, who you're with, what organization you represent, and tell us something interesting about yourself. And so I start, and one thing you didn't know, I did radio in Boston for 20 years. So having been a radio DJ for 20 years, so I start talking about that stuff, and then, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. And because I open up and I become transparent and I tell stuff about myself, then they start talking about themselves. And there was a
holding out on us, Lorenzo. You've been holding out. You should be. Yes, we're going to add a third co-host to this.
So there was a racial incident that happened at Yale a couple of years ago, and they brought me in, and I spent a few weeks with them. And some of the police officers, some of the community members that knew each other, that had an adversarial relationship, were sitting across the table kind of scowling at each other. But as they were going around the room and they started talking, one of the police officers decided to trust me and be transparent. And she started talking about the fact that she started this cancer survivor support group. And she talked about that in her struggle. And one of the people that was scowling across the table started getting really emotional. So then she said that she was a two-time cancer survivor. So now these two people that were at odds at each other now have a common bond. And during one of the breaks, they were both standing at the back of the room, and I'm watching, I'm not interceding. And then they were exchanging phone numbers, and the two of them hug each other. So now we see people who were adversaries at one point that realize we've got a common bond here. And that's what we try to do in the Center for Advanced Policing. We try to start from a common place, and then people get to move forward. Because ultimately, gentlemen, we all want the same thing in society. We're just viewing it from different places. And if we can hear each other's message, then I think we've got a chance to connect.
What is it? There are solutions, and they're great solutions that you just provided. There's solutions that are going on at that level, certainly with police departments, community leaders. What can everyday, ordinary citizens do to help stop the cycle of racism and violence and police brutality?
Well, that's a double-edged question there. And if someone were to say, and I've had the question innumerable times this week. What can the Black community do to kind of help solve this problem? To me, that's like asking, what can a battered woman do to kind of help fix her relationship? So if you look at the power dynamic, the onus is really on the system, because the system has all the power, the system has all the authority. And let's talk about the protests that are happening now. And it's not just about this one death or the last 3 deaths. A lot of people in the Black community in particular are dealing with vicarious trauma. And it seems like pretty regularly, maybe not every single week, but pretty regularly, they turn on the news or open up social media or go to their email, and they're seeing Black pain. They're seeing people of color being harmed by the criminal justice system or by other members of the community, other members of society. And the Black community as a whole, as a coherent entity, is going through this grieving process. And if you look at the 5 stages of grief, it starts with denial, then goes to anger. Stage 3 is bargaining. We're not going to talk about the last 2 stages because we haven't tried to get there yet. Because every time they go from the denial into anger to try to make something of it, and then they say, you know what, we need to do something. So they go to the bargaining, they go to the table. Okay, we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Then there's another killing that happens. So they never get to go through the grieving process. And the Black community for much of the last generation has been stuck in this perpetual cycle of anger in the grieving process. So to ask, why are these people doing this? They're angry. They're tired. And a lot of people are going through what I call racial battle fatigue. Every time this happens, it's a racial thing. And then the people in power point at Black and brown communities and say, okay, I need you to X, Y, and Z. But the power dynamic is, we need to stop asking people who are battered, why do you stay? We need to start asking batterers, why do you batter? So that's a different paradigm shift. So if we can think from that perspective, then we can have healing begin. And I've been seeing a lot of stuff, even here in Connecticut, where police officers, Tony Reyes from New Haven Police, had all of his police departments on the steps of police headquarters denouncing police brutality, and they renewed their oath of office. And I see the police chief sitting on the steps with community members having conversation. When the citizens decided to shut down I-84 in Hartford, if you notice, the state police walked up there with them, and a bunch of the officers kneeled with the citizens. And once that olive branch was given, they kind of did their prayers and they had conversation, and then they said, okay, we're being heard, so they moved off of the highway. The police could have handled that very differently. The police could have done what the current occupant of the White House did and decided, we're going to forcefully move people. We're going to gas people. We're going to show our authority. We've seen the police for 400 years show authority, and this is where we are today. So the paradigm shift is, if you think about, the police have the power. They determine a lot of the protests. They determine when things start and stop. So to use the analogy, the history of the jungle is written from the perspective of the hunter. The lion doesn't get to tell his story because oftentimes the lion is captured or killed. So if we do a paradigm shift, what would happen if we study policing from the perspective of the community? What if the police officers would listen to what's going on in the community and then say, we're all in this together, we're all trying to do the right thing? Because nobody in the community wants levels of violence. Nobody in the community wants bad neighborhoods. Nobody in the community wants types of crime. So everybody wants a safe community. Everybody wants to live in a community they can be proud of. But they're facing the issue from different perspectives. If we can get both groups together to have conversations, and every time I see the police kneel with citizens, I'm thinking, we've got a chance. And people are saying it's just photo ops. But you've got to start somewhere. It's an olive branch, and that's a great place to start.
Lorenzo, you wear many hats. You know, we mentioned as an educator, former police officer. You're also a father and a grandfather. What conversations have you had with your kids and grandkids over the years about racism in America and police brutality?
We tend to handle things head on. And my older daughter, who's my daughter's 30, and she just made a social media post, and I'm okay telling that it literally brought me to tears. She said when she was a little kid, she was afraid every time I went to work because she didn't want the bad guys to hurt me. Now that she's married, she says she's afraid every time her husband, a black male, goes out into the street or goes shopping or goes to work because she's afraid of his interaction that may happen with the police. And it's funny how that changes. So to have those conversations and to talk to my grandkids, and I had my grandson who is 6, who has the mind and the awareness of an adult. We were in the grocery store and we were waiting in line, and there was a uniformed police officer and a couple of people ahead of him. So my grandson let go of my hand and walked over and tapped the guy on the arm, and he looked down. And my grandson said, "Are you the police?" And he said, "Yes." And my grandson said, "Oh, that means you're a hero, because my grandfather used to be, and he's a hero." And the officer, you could see his face just kind of shine. And then he told my grandson, "Pick some candy. I'm buying you candy today." So little kids understand this, but how many times would my grandson have to see his father or grandfather laying face down with the police kneeling on him before he starts to think, wait, you're not the hero anymore. You're something else. You're a villain. How many times would that have to happen? And luckily, that hasn't happened to me or to my son-in-law. But if it were to happen, or to my grandson, when he grows up and becomes a teenager, being a young black man, how often would he have to do this before he stops trusting in the police? And we use the term unarmed black man as though the implication is most black men are armed, or most black men are to be dangerous. So the term unarmed black man, to me, is kind of offensive, because we have to add this whole nother level to show victimhood. Just to say a black man was killed by the police, the first question is, what did he do? Was he armed? So that being the default, I think, is problematic. And then the question is, when police officers say, particularly to black and brown incidents, that I feared for my life, so I discharged my weapon. Can a black man really be unarmed if your skin color is seen as a weapon?
That's a heavy question, Lorenzo. I don't know. I don't even know how to begin to answer that, or if there is an answer to that. I would hope that just because somebody's skin color is different than someone else's, that doesn't automatically make them a weapon or a threat. But as you've explained and pointed out, we know that that's ingrained in us, unfortunately.
Yeah, and even at my position now, and I was talking to somebody, I probably, any given week, I talk to 10 police chiefs, probably 20 different officers, and going through the contacts in my phone, I've got probably 50, 60, 70 police chiefs, their direct cell number in my phone. But a few years ago, I was driving from the BWI airport to a hotel in the inner harbor of Baltimore, because I was given a keynote address at the National Sheriff's Association. And as I'm driving up 295, a police car pulls in right behind me. And I look in my rearview mirror, he's immediately behind me. And then I get that clenched feeling in my stomach, and my mouth got dry, and I felt my heart beat racing. And I remember thinking to myself, which police chief in the Baltimore area do I have on speed dial? Can I roll through my contacts during this traffic stop, to determine, can I get out of this with a little or no issue? I looked at the speedometer. I wasn't speeding, and I was in the same lane the whole time. I was in a good space, and the car stayed on me for about a mile, and then it pulled off, and it dawned on me, oh, he just was trying to get to the next lane. But imagine me, who's been in the sheriff's department for 15 years, that's trained and taught and researched police for 20 years. If I get that visceral reaction when the police pull up behind me, What about people in the community that have no relationship with the police or have a negative relationship with the police? How do they feel? And that's the problematic part. So how do we make that shift? And that, unfortunately, for the purposes of today's conversation, that may be a rhetorical question.
Lorenzo, we're fortunate enough to get you here for an hour and just, ask so many questions and get to the depth of so much of this. When you're teaching classes on campus, both here and other institutions you've been, as you go through a semester, I'm sure you weave this information throughout those courses, whatever they may be. Compare that experience to when you train, police officers, and what I'm sure you have to consolidate everything all at once, and how you intellectually handle a podcast versus training police officers versus the classroom.
Well, fortunately for me, it's not very different because all of the training, all of the speaking, all of the teaching that I do comes from the heart and it comes from a place of compassion. And my number one goal at the end, get people to understand. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind. I don't want to change your perspective. And I may not even be trying to change your behavior, but I'm trying to get you to view things from a lens that you don't typically view. I'm trying to build levels of empathy because I can't externally change you. What I can do is show you life from my perspective or help you understand lives from other people's perspective. And then if you can take inventory of who you are, what you believe is important, what you think are salient points of your personality, the change has to come from inside. But the change doesn't come by me sticking an accusatory finger in someone's face and calling them a racist. And I don't talk about people based on who they are. I talk about actions. So one of the things that I train, police officers don't stop drivers. They stop vehicles for vehicle action. So it's not about who the person is. It is not about what the person did. This vehicle did this illegal action. And because you're operating the vehicle, now I'm dealing with you because I can't have the conversation with an inanimate object. So I take it from that perspective. It's hard to tell people not to make this personal because it is. It's really personal every day. And I was talking to a colleague a couple of weeks ago, a colleague from a university, and an administrator from another university from another part of the country. And different administrators and I, because we've built relationships, we were all assistant professors together 20 years ago, and we're all in various levels of administration. And from time to time, they've reached out to me and we're talking. And this one guy I like a lot, and we were talking about the racial dynamic. And I asked him, I said, okay, it's 9 o'clock. So when was the last time somebody reminded you of your whiteness? And he thought about it, and he kind of, banged his, I heard him bang his fist on the table. He goes, I've got the example. About 3 weeks ago, I was doing this, and he told me the story. And I said, that's cute. 3 weeks ago, somebody reminded you of your whiteness. I said, it's 9 a.m. and twice already today, somebody reminded me of my blackness. Twice today, and I haven't had breakfast yet. So when the racial element comes to the forefront, and there's nothing inherent about the color of my skin that makes me a different person, but it does give me different experiences that I've managed to work into the classroom. And I tend to be really transparent. And with students, I tell them about a lot of failures that I've had when I was in uniform. I tell them about mistakes that I've made. And then I tell them how that ate away at me. And I tell them that even now, and I left uniform on July 17, 2001. That's my last day in uniform, 3:30 p.m. And there are still things in my life now that I think about. There are still dreams that I have because of things that I've seen. And 20 years later, this stuff still bothers me. And I try to explain to students that if you're not feeling other people's pain, there's a problem. You may want to rethink what you're doing if you're not allowing yourself to empathize. So these are the things I try to bring not only in the classroom, but also with policing. And I spend a lot of time talking about the ugly underbelly of policing. And I tell people that The divorce rate in the general populace is about 54%. The divorce rate for policing is almost 70%. Police officers are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than the general population. Police officers are 300 times more likely to be alcoholic than the general population. And if I can arm people with this, because I don't want this to be some secret thing that sneaks up on our students, when they get on the job and they're blindsided by this. I want them to be able to see these bad things that could conceivably happen. But if you're properly equipped emotionally, policing is a fantastic career opportunity. For the right person, it's the best job in the world. And we're trying to figure out who those right people are. And we're trying to give them the right skill set so they can be the absolute best people they can be in policing, and they can further the conversation.
As a society, Lorenzo, where do we go from here? You mentioned earlier the olive branch between police departments and the community. What does the future hold for us, or are you optimistic about police and community and race relations?
Well, J.W., being a student of history, looking at the last 400 years of our nation, it's hard to be really optimistic about what's going forward. But in spite of our history, I feel good about where we're going, because the protests now are just a little different than the protests in Baltimore. I was on the ground of day 4 in Baltimore. I was on the ground of day 3 in Ferguson. And watching the LA riots, it's a little different now, because we're starting to see a lot more of our white brothers and sisters there. We're seeing younger people. We're seeing the impassioned generation come up. People are demanding change. But the flip side is we also see the negative rhetoric coming from our federal leaders that are divisive. And people are seeing that we're being divided. And people are thinking we're better than this. We can move forward. On occasion, there are still students or young people or teenagers or whoever that have missed the message, and we have to go back and rethink, how we're teaching people. And maybe we need to do a little more compassion, or maybe we need to have students deal with a more variety of teachers. And I was teaching a class at the University of New Haven last semester, and I developed 2 classes. One was policing fragile communities, and the other class was appearance bias in crime. And I was asking how many people are CJ majors, and how many people, is this a required class? And a lot of people said, no, it was an elective. And I said, okay, why are you taking this class? What about this class? And one guy raised his hand and says, you want me to be totally honest? I said, absolutely. He says, I've never had an African-American professor before. I just wanted to see what it was like. He's a graduating senior. It was his last semester. He went through his whole career not having a person of color teach him. So at the end of the class, I said, so what was the difference? And he says, in one way, you weren't any different at all. He was talking about pedagogy. He said, but the other difference, you taught from a different perspective. And he says, I never thought about passion. He said, to me, passion is like religion, and it belongs in church. It doesn't belong in the classroom. It doesn't belong in the real world. And he says, but now I see differently, that we have to start from a position of passion, and that's what's going to make a difference. And at that point, I could have gone to the president and said, I could do this for free. I'm not going to, but I can almost do this for free if that's what I'm getting. In the classroom, I particularly look at the people, and body language is real. And I do well teaching online, but I do my best teaching face-to-face, because I can read body language. And the students that sit back and cross their arms or give me the scowl, then those are the students I try to work with. But then when I'm teaching, I'm going through and I'm sharing and I'm being open and honest, and I'm using empirical data to support my arguments, then you see the light bulbs come on over people's heads, and you see in their face when they start to get it. And again, I'm not trying to change minds, I'm trying to change hearts. And that's a different thing. And if we can do that, I think we've got a chance to move forward.
Lorenzo, I think that's a perfect segue into, again, thinking of who's watching us or listening to us: students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends of the program, meaning the university, and folks who may have no connection to UNH. What are some action items that you would share with us or ask us as a university or an athletics department What can we do going forward that moves us forward as a society or a campus or an athletics department?
Build relationship. Build relationship. Be open and honest, and it's okay. And there've been a lot of white citizens who've reached out to me and said, "I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel." And that's okay. That's absolutely okay not to know, because we're in different places. It's okay not to know, but it's not okay to be silent. When you see things that are wrong, when you see things that are problematic, say something. Because there's a lot of people that will say stuff in the room with all white people that they would dream of saying when I walked into the room. So when you hear these things, when you hear the comments, when you hear the snide remarks, when you hear the little jokes, stop them and say, that's not bridge building. You know, you don't have to say, you're a racist. That's not where we want to go. Because once we start attaching negative labels, the conversation stops. And we never want to stop conversation. But just say, that's not a bridge building technique. Or even better, I'm not comfortable with that rhetoric. Or I'm not comfortable with that language. Because when you start telling people that your words have power and your words are harmful, let them see how people are being harmed. That's a good way to start. What's never okay is being silent, because silence often looks like complicity.
You are the assistant provost for diversity and inclusion at the University of New Haven. How does our school do with diversity and inclusion?
Well, the short answer is we're doing a lot better than we have in the past. And those are two very separate incidents. Diversity is not just race, it's not just ethnicity, it's LGBTQ, it's levels of access, it's different religion. We want different people, because folks come from different backgrounds, they bring different things to the table. And if you were building a restaurant and you wanted to build this big restaurant and all you had was dessert chefs, what kind of restaurant is that? Doesn't it make sense? You want somebody that can build salads. You want somebody that cooks steak. You want somebody that can do some of the other things. The more you bring people in with different backgrounds, the better the institution is. So the diversity part is one part. The second part is the inclusion part. What can we do to make people feel like they're part of Charger Nation? And again, I've been here less than 2 years, but whenever I go and there are new people, I go to them and I welcome them to Charger Nation and say, we're happy that you're here. And we want people to feel like they're part of the university. They're part of our Charger Nation. And how do you do that? You do that by reaching out. You do that by a smile. You do that by a handshake. Well, back then a handshake. Now you wave from 6 feet away. But you try to just show people that their thoughts and that their ideas are really important. And if you look at administration, if you look at faculty, if you look at students, we want the best and brightest of whoever we have, but we also don't want a whole bunch of dessert chefs. We want different people from different backgrounds that bring different things to the table, because there's all sorts of stuff that we may not have thought about. So prior to having an assistant provost for diversity and inclusion, imagine right now, today, imagine right now that the president and the provost didn't have the forethought to build this position. Mm-hmm. Who would then be the spokesperson for the university? Who would then help build bridges? There's a lot of other people that will. It's not singularly my job, but having this position here definitely makes it easier and definitely gives a voice to help move things forward. So we've got a shot. We can move forward. The university is doing much better. We're acknowledging things. We're teaching about the Holocaust. We're teaching about racial dynamics in the 60s. We're teaching about how slavery moved forward. We're teaching about economic imbalances. We're talking about different communities. We're talking more about fragile communities. And I use the term a lot. Unfortunately, I don't define the term fragility in communities a lot. A fragile community is a community, regardless of race or ethnicity, that have significant barriers to social and economic upward mobility, whether because of lack of education or lack of income, lack of job readiness, or addiction or whatever. those are the communities that we need to deal with. And when I train the police, I start off with the scenario. I asked how many people have gone out to dinner in the last week. Everybody's raised their hand. And I said, I know you guys haven't, but with me, it seems like every restaurant I go to, you get that wobbly table. You know, how many people have had that? I said, so what do you do when you get the wobbly table? You get a bunch of your friends, you lift the table, you take it out back and you throw it in the dumpster? No, you don't at all. What you do is you take a bunch of napkins or you fold up the menu and you stick it under the leg of the table. You try to add support to the fragile table. You add support where it's fragile. So if we do the paradigm shift and start thinking about communities, because words matter, because if we call them bad communities or crime communities or hotspots, as the police like to say, then there's a more aggressive view. But if we look at the communities for what they are, fragile communities, then the answer is not enforcement. The answer is adding levels of stability and adding resources. Because crime is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of much larger problems in society. And if we can deal with those underlying problems, particularly with the lens of compassion, then the crime problem kind of takes care of itself. The racism problem starts to dwindle. The divisions that we have in society, they start to dwindle when we start having the underlying problems addressed.
Dr. Z, any final questions for Lorenzo before we say thank you very much?
Yeah, will you please come back?
Yeah.
I feel like, you took us to some real depth. So it's not like we just scratched the surface here, but I feel like there's so much more to talk about. And selfishly, from an athletics point of view, would love to get into those dialogues about, when you're in college athletics, you're in one of the more diverse populations of the university. And therefore, there's a whole nother, there's a lot of great stories in there.
Mm.
There really are. But there's also pain, and you can't ignore that. So that's certainly, when you free up, please come back with us. And I'll be bothering you a lot between here and there with other things. I have a request for you with our department that I'm going to ask you as soon as we get offline here. But
Absolutely, Doc. You can have me whenever you want. Anytime you need me, call me, and I'm here to be helped.
Thank you.
Lorenzo, what final words of wisdom do you want to leave us with today?
It's all about compassion. Understand that people are hurting. There's a lot of people that are out there protesting, and I get that it's a real inconvenience for you when people block a highway. And I get that it's a real inconvenience when stores are shut down. How inconvenient do you think it is for the family of George Floyd? What about the inconvenience of the people who are killed when they shouldn't be killed? So if we think about things from a level of compassion and understand the trauma that people are going through, then I think we can move forward. Just be compassionate.
Great advice. Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, the Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion here at the University of New Haven, and also the Director of the Center for Advanced Policing. Lorenzo, thank you for joining us today on the Dr. Z and J.W podcast, and thank you for everything that you do, not only for the university and our students and the police officers, but everyone that you help across the country. Certainly at this time of our history, but everything you're going to do for us going forward, we certainly appreciate it. You're a hero. You were a hero when you were in uniform. You're definitely a hero now.
Thank you. I'm just a regular guy trying to make a difference. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Thank you.
Dr. Lorenzo Boyd joining us here on the Dr. Z and J.W podcast. And before Dr. Z and I think about a few things, we'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, the Pink Clover Foundation, both a partner and a friend to the University of New Haven. Pink Clover Foundation honors the late Colleen Sorbello, who passed away in September of 2017 after a 4-year battle with breast cancer. Colleen's husband, Sam, played football at UNH and has been one of our university's biggest benefactors. In 2018, Sam and his family dedicated the Colleen Sorbello Research Laboratory in Dodds Hall and established the Colleen Sorbello Memorial Breast Cancer Research Award, which supports a student pursuing breast cancer research. For more information on how you can help in the battle against breast cancer and supporting breast cancer research, you go to pinkcloverfoundation.org. All right, Dr. Z, a quick breath there to kind of take it all in. That's a lot. That's a lot. We knew this would be a lot. I mean, we went about an hour with Lorenzo. You could go 2 or 3 times that long, and you still wouldn't get to everything. It's impossible to to try to summarize what's going on in our country and has been going on in our country for 400 years. But what did you take away from what he said today?
Just his breadth of experience, and that we're lucky to have him here at UNH, and that I hope our listeners stayed with us through the podcast, because there was so much to be heard and learned, and that we will continue to have these important conversations, not just on this podcast, but on this campus, in our department. These conversations and this dialogue and this learning process from experts such as Dr. Boyd is, I believe, the only way forward.
Yep. I agree. I think the one theme that he kept hammering home, and he said it there at the end, and that's compassion, right? We need to treat each other with compassion and empathy and kindness and respect. This is something I know I speak about to my students in the classes at UNH. You know, this is how we were all raised. Regardless of what religion you are, or if you are religious at all, I think we can all subscribe to the golden rule, right? And that's do unto others as you'd have done to you. And I think we can all agree that we would like to be treated the same way that, you know, we should treat other people the way we want to be treated. And again, that goes across, I would hope, racial lines and religious lines. And I think if you come from that place, if you come from a place of, you know, from your heart, you know, from empathy and compassion, I think we can do a lot in terms of bridging these gaps. And if Lorenzo has, you know, some optimism about this, then that's great. We should all be optimistic. But that's only one part of it. There's a lot of other levels to it, keeping the conversation going. As he alluded to, you want to make sure that you put people in office at the local, federal, state levels who are going to help out with regard to police and community relations and improve race relations. You can support companies and businesses who have a strong track record of diversity and inclusion. And I think the younger generation gets that. I hope all generations get it. But I think that, as Lorenzo pointed out, the students that he sees on a day-to-day basis, the students and the student athletes that we see, Dr. Z, I think they get it. I mean, I know when I talk to them in class, it's easy for me to see the light bulb go off. And I would think you, with your background in sports, especially in football, and Lorenzo played football as well, when someone scored a touchdown, Dr. Z, it didn't matter who they were, right? It didn't matter if they're black or white or Hispanic or Asian or gay or straight. You gave them a hug, right?
Yeah. You know, that's the beauty of sport, you know, teams. And we can learn a lot. And I'm sure there are researchers who study this. We can learn a lot from teams and how it brings people together from all backgrounds. And there's a lot to be said there. I think as you ask that question or pose that question, I'm thinking, you know, Lorenzo's got my brain rolling, and I'm thinking of, there's the teamwork and then there's the competition. And I think there's a fine line as we teach young people how to compete, that you compete together toward a common goal. And in our society today with social media and whatnot, I think there's a lot of unintended competition with others. And that may be just a small part of what's going in our society today, that we need to come together with love and teamwork, as opposed to competing so much. And that's just a thought going through my mind now as we come to a wrap.
Yep. I think as leaders, we all want to unite. We don't want to divide, right? We want to unite people. That's how good teams succeed, whether it's a sports team, whether it's a business, whether it's our campus community, or whether it's us as the United States or us as the world, right? We're all on the same team, and we all need to be better teammates and lead with compassion and empathy. I think that about wraps it up. Unless there's anything else you want to add, Dr. Z, I think we've covered a lot of territory today. We certainly have a lot to think about going forward.
Thanks, J.W. And again, to Dr. Boyd, most meaningful podcast we've had and maybe ever will.
Yep, I agree. And we certainly hope for the best for the future. And again, more than just hoping, there's hard work that needs to be done from everyone's perspective for us to move forward as a great society. Again, thanks to Dr. Lorenzo Boyd for joining us today. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, the Pink Clover Foundation. For more information, you go to pinkcloverfoundation.org. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today. Please follow us on social media to stay up to date on when our next episodes will launch. Again, our podcasts are available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. For Dr. Z, producer Broccoli Rob Thompson, our executive producer Jonathan Mays, and for Lorenzo Boyd, I'm J.W. Stewart. Thanks for joining us here on the Dr. Z and J.W. podcast. We'll see you next time.